Thank you so much for coming this morning. I know that Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, you are always out doing things like this, aren't you? Has everybody had coffee this morning? No? Oh. Well, please don't throw anything at me then, okay, in light of the lack of your coffee. Thank you so much again for coming this morning. Looking forward to walking through all that we have in store. Trust that you will be equipped and encouraged in the journey that is before you. I'm looking forward to sharing what Martha and I get to do each summer, digging up dinosaur bones, which is kind of cool, but really beyond that, there is greater things that we see, a greater level of a message that is going to be impactful, and we'll unfold that. The general theme of what I want to accomplish today is theology and science. That's not just a title, but it is an idea as well. And so much of how we are educated, how we journey through life is we see theology and science as two completely separate domains that should never overlap. And I do not believe that's the case. I recognize the distinction between the two, but as people, we think with both paradigms in mind. And to the larger extent, when there is conflict between our understanding of science and theology, how do we resolve that, and which one gets to drive the ship, so to speak? Which one gets to be the authority? I'll tell you in a nutshell that my heartbeat for us for today is that theology should drive our science. Be good scientists. Practice the craft, the trade, even in an amateur sense. Be good observers of your world. But without a sound theological orientation and background, we're going to miss it. For this morning, we have 3 sessions. We're going to work through each session. We'll have a brief Q&A at the end of each time, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break. And then we'll move back into the next session. I'm going to try to keep us on track as best we can on time. I appreciate you taking time around our fossil table over there. That is something the Lord has enabled us to have and to dig up. Much of that represents the things that we have excavated through the years. So let's dig in. Let me open us up with a word of prayer. Father, I thank you so much for blessing us with these days, with these moments. Father, may your Spirit move amongst this room. May the hearts and minds be not just open in general, but we may be open to your movement and to your teaching and understanding. May you give me the words to speak, the clarity of thought as we move through the morning. Most of all, may you be glorified, even amongst the struggles and strifes that we feel and sense in the world. We want to be vessels shaped by you, Father. So thank you for your continued investment and love into us, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Now, let me open this up with a story here. We had a medical doctor came out and dug with us several years ago. She expressed being an evolutionist to me earlier that morning. Our dig was delayed that particular day because of rain. And as we talked, and she shared these ideas, I said, you understand that what we do is from a biblical worldview. We trust in a biblical history, and we build all of our thinking along this line. I just want you to understand that. So she did. Martha had started digging, and she found the edge of this bone that you see in the picture here. It's a metatarsal. It's a foot bone from an edmontosaur. Now, the edmontosaur dinosaurs can get quite big. They can be 25, 30 feet long and probably weigh 4 to 6 tons, depending on full-grown size. So they're fairly substantial. And as we worked in, you could tell she was getting worked up. In fact, you'll see the joy in her face. I think part of her enthusiasm was that she was getting to actually work on a dinosaur bone, and she was excited by that, and I can understand that. And we have people that they have this, wow, this is bones thing, but Some people are kind of amazed by the idea of time. They believe they're holding something that's, if you will, 65 million years old, and that fascinates them. But that's not where we're coming from with this. And what I went on to tell her is, I said, picture this. I said, if what we believe is true, that dinosaurs were buried in one global cataclysm, as described in Scripture, and that cataclysm, that global flood, came as a result of man's sin, then what you're holding in your hands is evidence that God judges sin. You know? And so I would love to tell you that it resonated with her and she ran with it, and the rest of the day was beautiful in that respect. I don't know how God used that moment. But it's these kind of opportunities that we're mindful of as we take people digging, where I am fascinated and I could bore you to death with just dinosaur stuff. But what I want you to do and to hear amongst all of that this morning is a greater message. That the fact we have dinosaurs or any fossil in the ground is a result of a global judgment by water from God. Now, what's beautiful in that narrative is this picture of an ark where God literally saved life. And so in the same way, God has provided a Savior through Jesus Christ. And so when we are in Christ, we are saved, if you will, from judgment. And these bones give us these moments that are beautiful and an opportunity to declare the message. Now, the particulars of why we're here. 2011, we went up to Glendive, Montana to fulfill a childhood dream. I, like a lot of little boys and little girls, wanted to be a paleontologist. Can you imagine that? A little boy or a little girl wanting to be a paleontologist. But in God's providence, 45 years later, he brought me up to Montana and gave me an opportunity to dig. You see the picture of the man in the left here. This is Otis Klein. He's the founder of the museum. And in many respects, God worked in his life in a unique way as well, to bring him to literally purchase 37 acres of ranch land to dig up dinosaur bones and to build a 20,000 square foot museum, which we work for now, for the sole purpose of having people come up. So consider this an invitation. Come see us in Montana. Now, I would be remiss in saying a word about my wife to start, because she has been my helpmeet. She's been my friend. That first dig, she said, I'm just going to come watch and take pictures. And here we are 10 years later, and she is a gift to me. She's a gift to the ministry that we do. Her organizational skills, her attention to detail is such a blessing to me. And for those of you who have husbands or wives that work together in that relationship, you understand the beauty of that dynamic, and we're thankful for that. Now, where do we go? We drive up to eastern Montana. This is what I call, if you will, the not as attractive side of the state. We don't have mountain ranges, forests. Once you get over 3 trees, you're into forest country. We go to Montana to dig up dinosaur bones because this is where they are. Now, this is not the only location bones exist. This is a unique exposure of dinosaur fossils here. And what has happened geologically is during the flood, the layers of sediment would have been laid down, and within particular layers of sediment would have been the dinosaur fossils. Now, geologically, while the ground was still wet in the aftermath of the flood, if you think about a tablecloth, if you compress your tablecloth, what's going to happen? It's going to have ridges in it, folds in it. Geologically, that same idea happens, and those that go up are what we call geologically an anticline. And so geologically in this area, there was a compression and lift of sediment, and the top layers that were covering the dinosaur layer were stripped away from the flood runoff, bringing the dinosaur bone layer to the surface. We're in what's called the Hell Creek Formation. Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus. But beyond that, we also have 3 or 4 different kinds of fish, turtles, crocodilians. And what's interesting about this place is the idea of modern or living fossils. Because from the secular standpoint, where we go is supposed to be 65 to 67 million years old. And yet what we do is we dig up modern-looking creatures. Meaning that out of the love of my heart, I bought my wife for her birthday a few years ago an alligator skull. So guys, that's just a little tidbit for you. Just if you need that special thing for your wife, I'm giving of my heart. It had a practical purpose because what we find is we dig up alligator skulls, portions of them. And so as we need to help identify them, we just go to the modern equivalent and can place the bones in orientation because we have a modern equivalent. Now think about this. Evolution is supposed to be the slow, gradual progression of life, modifications, body plan modifications over millions of years. And so if what we have dug up, 65 million years old, when you find a modern equivalent, my logic tells me that evolution should drive some level of genetic change. And yet we see none. The crocodiles are crocodiles, the gators are gators, the bowfin fish are bowfin, the guitar fish are what they are. The turtles, same thing. We dig up snapping turtles, but they don't call them snapping turtles in that sense. So you get an idea that really evolution is not at play here in the fossil record. Now to give you a sense of what the ground looks like here, you have a lot of rough terrain, and this rough terrain gives us evidence and it shows us that water has been at play here, at least on 2 levels. First of all is we see the deposition phase where we see layers, strata all through the ground, through the hills. The only way for that strata to build up is for large volumes of water to move sediment. And what happens, you could do this with a 2-liter Coke bottle. You put 3 different kinds of sediment in it, put water in it, shake it up, and just set it down. And what happens is the sediment sorts itself out. And so this same idea is happening on a grand scale. The other level with water is you see the idea of erosion. So what you're looking at are large canyons that have been opened up by vast amounts of water. And so we're not so much digging into a mountain, but what we're digging into is where the flat ground has eroded out, and now we're dropping down into those valleys and digging into the sides of the hills, trying to find that particular layer in which fossils exist. Now, to take you up to the dig site where we spend most of our time, we start down at the shelter, we make those observations. I remind people, don't step on the cactus and watch for rattlesnakes. We were fortunate to only see 3 this year, and I saw they were really pretty. I couldn't get rid of one of them, in particular, a little golden brown marking on his body. Just as he crawled right through the middle of a handful of people I was just about to take down to start digging. So we remind him that God's creation exists in many forms around us. As we make our way up, we're looking for something called float. Float is where large bone has been buried, and as it gets exposed, it starts to dry out, and little pieces of that bone will break off and, if you will, float down to a flat spot. So when we're walking into a canyon, we're actually looking down here, not up here. And so as we look down here, we're trying to find and trace back up the hill Where is the source? Where is that bone coming from? This is what in 2016 I was able to do. I was down below and found some bone. Started to trace it up the hill. And for 3 days, can you see me there? I look little there. I had to carve into the hill a place just to sit and put my feet as I dug into the hill. But we kept finding bone and we kept going. We've been digging on this spot 5 years now. This is the other side, and to give you a sense of this bone layer, we think in terms of the layers, the strata. The bone layers are going to be flat, and so what we need to do is we work the hill back, and so we anticipate as we go back that the hills surrounding us will also have similar layers that we can deal with. This is a couple of years later. I think this is the end of 19, and you can see how we begin to cut back into the hill. And what Martha's standing on in this picture is in essence the bone layer. That's the layer we're trying to get down to. And we keep pushing the hill back. And again, we anticipate going back in. Most of our work, or a great deal of our work, the manual labor side, is just clearing what we call overburden, where that section, as you see in this picture up top, is not going to produce fossils. We're trying to get down to that lower level, and so we work to take the hill back. We started the first week in June with a group of diggers just come up and help us clear back sediment. As much as I would love to bring a bulldozer up there or some piece of construction equipment, there's not a good way to get anything up there. So it's just shovels, pry bars, picks, and manual labor. If you are just dying to exert yourself, come see me after today. Now, one of the fun things we get to do, and this is just a personal thing here, is rolling big rocks and boulders down the hill. I find that sometimes I am 10 years old up here on the dig site, even though I am a long way from 10 years old. But we get to roll them down the hill. I'm just telling you, there's some satisfaction with this, okay? And this was our team this summer, Martha and Hannah-Laura and Michelle and Daniel and Aaron and Lee and Joshua. If you know the Haley family, Chuck is now the assistant director in the museum, and Daniel and Joshua spent a good bit of the summer out digging with us. They were a lot of fun. I found that Joshua's got a unique little personality, and those of you who know him well will understand this. But when he's out there, he'll say, "Mr. Tommy, look at this," and I never know what I'm about to see. In this case, Joshua, I kind of title this next picture, Joshua knows no limits to how he's going to find bone. And so Joshua dug this hole, and then I said, it just kind of unfolded at a good moment, but they're a wonderful family, and Daniel and Joshua in particular were a joy to work with. Now to the particulars of when we're down on the dig site working through and beginning to get in. We've got to the bone layer, the overburden's back. We're starting here this woman's working on a Triceratops rib. It's going into the wall, which means as we're doing the floor, if this were the wall that we're pushing back, that means the rib was going the direction I really didn't want it to go, which means that overburden becomes more challenging because it's a long bone, and it's also, we've got a lot of ground. There's probably 10 foot tall of dirt that I've got to take down. So as she began to work back on it, she was able to get about 2 feet of it exposed. And as we're digging, we're not just picking the bone up out of the ground. As much as I see little boys wanting to just pick stuff up, and every once in a while, I got it out, and I'm like, we weren't ready to get it out. We're looking to create what we call a pedestal. Think of a mushroom, where you've got the stem, and the top of the mushroom kind of overhangs its stem, and that's the idea of what we're trying to get to. And so we're going to take all the dirt off the top and even create a little cavity underneath so that we can begin the process of creating a fill jacket around it. And the first layer is to add aluminum foil. This gives us that first level of stability because these bones are always broken. As much as those bones over there may be solid, they represent hours of work gluing them together and stabilizing them, making sure. In fact, Martha reminded me yesterday, she said, this Triceratops jaw has got a piece that's loose. So we're always trying to be mindful of, even here, something might come loose that we didn't know about. So this foil gives that first level of stability and protection. And then we come back, we use some of the medical bandages, sometimes with pre-done plaster on them. We'll just wet them and wrap them, or we'll use literal plaster and just take burlap bags and just dip it into the mixture and wrap it around. It's just like if you had a broken bone and you have a cast, this is what we're trying to accomplish here. Here's another example of this procedure. We have a Triceratops femur here. Who likes Triceratops? It's your favorite dinosaur, and you would pick it over T-Rex. That's what those are the people I will. Yeah, there's a few of us. Okay, good. I just want to identify you in the crowd, okay? Now we have this leg bone here, and we're going to do the same thing where the screwdrivers are. I thought it would be good if we had some plaster that would run underneath to help keep it in the plaster jacket. Because that is literally a concern, is when you go to flip it over, if bone starts falling out, that is a really bad day. And that's what we're not trying, we don't want that to happen. As you see, we put the foil on, we're going through, and we have some really advanced tools. This may look like a milk jug to you. This is a paleo bucket designed specifically for plaster work, okay? So don't be confused by this procedure here. We take the plaster and start wrapping it around the bone until we eventually will flip it over. Hopefully we don't see bone, which is the ideal, and then we clear off the dirt that was underneath until we see the bone, and then we carry that out. One other project we got to work on this year. Martha, can you get the tibia? Martha was digging what we call a drainage trench, and she came across the bone, and we let this young man, thank you. So what you see, I'm going to be much more cavalier with it than she will be. What you see in the picture is this bone right here. This is a Montosaurus tibia, which is your lower leg bone. This is real. And it still has more prep to go. We pulled it out. You can see the fractures here. It came out in these pieces. And so I've glued it together. Hopefully it will stay together, that we've got glues designed to keep things together. And we'll go through the process of cleaning it up. It looks like what we would call a sub-adult, which means it's probably a teenager. This could get quite a bit bigger than what you see right here. I'm just going to put this right over here, okay? She makes sure I don't do too many crazy things with these bones. Now, we call Martha the tooth lady. She loves finding teeth. And actually, the teeth are quite plentiful. Not always in the jaw, but they're quite plentiful just loose in the ground. They preserve really well in the fossil record because of the enamel over them. This is what you see on the left is a Triceratops tooth. It's actually in good shape. Now, what's interesting about the Triceratops jaw is a few things. First of all, you've got a lower jaw left and right and an upper jaw left and right. And they will run about 40 teeth, but they also will stack on top of one another as much as 5 at a time, which means, oh, I thank you. Thank you, Vanna. This is a Triceratops jaw. This is a small one. And you'll see some grooves right here. And so what happens is the teeth work in a curved fashion, and they're always being pushed up. Now, the jaw is slicing vegetation. So as the tooth is hitting vegetation, it is wearing down. And most of the teeth that we find are worn down on the top. And so as it gets smaller and smaller, it will fall out, and the next one will come in. Now, with this many teeth, it has It's conceivable that a Triceratops could have 800 teeth in its mouth. Now, what you see is one in this picture that's not been erupted. It's not chewed on food yet. There's just a little bit of root right down here. You can see the carina, you can see the denticles here. And again, one would just stack right on top of the other. The other thing is the one on the right is a raptor tooth. You see the serrations on the bottom. Now that is a 1/4 of an inch tooth. So if you were to just kind of look at your pinky nail, we're talking something along that size and maybe even smaller. So the raptors were very small. In fact, if you think about what Jurassic Park, the velociraptors were what? As tall as humans. In reality, velociraptors are about 2 feet tall. They're much smaller animals. Now, there are some variations that do get bigger. Now, as we work through the ground, we get to take people with smiles and excitement and enthusiasm. You may even notice those people up in the right-hand corner. Some of you may know them. Brian and Annalyn came up with us and dug with us this summer and had a good time. This little boy in the middle was really fun. He came, I think, 2 years ago, 10 years old, and Martha had just uncovered a tyrannosaur tooth. Now, that's cool for us. But she hollered at him and asked him if he would like to come over and work on this, and he was very calm. And she talked through the process, be careful, dig in dirt. And then it got exposed, and we stake our tool underneath, or screwdriver, whatever we're working with, to flip it over. And she said, "Do you want to pick it up?" And he said, "Me?" She said, "Yeah." So he picked it up very carefully and then posed for this picture. And then he said, "Can I give it back to you?" And as soon as he gave it to Martha, he started jumping up and down with excitement. But he controlled himself very well. And so there was these kind of moments that you can't plan for that just show up in the process. You never know what's going to capture people along the way. Once we leave the field, we move into the lab and start the process of putting these guys back together. And we use various tools. Most of the time, we just start people off with dental tools. If any of you got leftover dental picks somewhere at your house, we could probably use them. And it's just a process of where we're in the ground, you've got a lot of dirt and you're trying to find bone in the dirt. When you get into the lab, the procedure flips. You know you've got bone, but you're trying to determine, how do I get the dirt off? What's dirt? And that becomes, for people the first time, a really difficult barrier sometimes for certain fossils, because they're afraid if they scrape, they're going to be damaging the bone. And chances are you could very well, but that's part of what we deal with. This young lady, Michelle, came out and was an intern with us this summer. And this is back in 19, and just open up whatever fossil she's got. We start working on cleaning it up. We're trying to figure out how to piece things back together and to stabilize any loose pieces and begin to introduce more tools. This is just some of the people that have come and dug and done lab time with us this summer. This has been a really great thing. What we now do is we take people out in the mornings, we dig up to lunchtime, and then we come back in the afternoon and we do fossil prep time. So those things they dug up in the morning, they get to actually clean up and glue together in the afternoon. We found that adds so much value, not just the experience, but just looking at what you've got. Because sometimes you can pull things out of the ground that are in 6 pieces and covered in dirt, and you get home and you're like, what have I got? But if you can put it together and have it visually mean something. Because let me just remind you, I know you know this, but this is something that hits me about 2 or 3 times every summer. What we're digging up was once a living animal walking across this earth. And while it may be looking like just a thing now, it represents a life. And that, to me, every once in a while resonates with me in unique ways. Kyle was another young man that worked with us this summer, and you see him here working with what we call a micron blaster. We use compressors to go through the machine. We add baking soda into a canister, and compressed air blows baking soda out, and we work on cleaning the fossils, kind of more of a finishing touch. Here's some young people working within what we call our blasting box, where you see that nozzle that they're both holding is the compressed air, and the baking soda is coming out, and it is working against the bone itself. Let me give you, this is a T-Rex tibia. And to give you just a quick sense, I could do this for hours. Now, you may not want to watch me do it for hours, but it's a process that moves slowly. But as you can see, we're moving the sediment off a little bit at a time. I'm watching for new cracks to show up. I'm watching for loose pieces of bone. And so we kind of work through this procedure. Another tool we use is a micro jack. It's like a mini jackhammer. It's designed so that when it hits the surface, it's not pounding into it like a jackhammer would. It's got a very soft touch, a level of finesse to it, but it also gives us the ability to impact a surface, to remove sediment. And here's what this, now you probably could get enough of that real quick. Is anybody at the dentist now? We got to work on, a few years ago, a Triceratops vertebra. It was a thoracic vertebra. I'll talk more specifically about the vertebra themselves in in the next session. But we got to dig on this one. This is a very complete one. It turned out to be a really cool find. As it started in the lab, you can hear working with a dental pick. Again, I'm trying to distinguish what's bone, what's sediment, kind of getting familiar with the bone, what needs to come off. Sometimes I look at even videos and I'm like, slow down. Martha and I are the people that when we watch the opening scene of Jurassic Park and they're brushing on the bones on the ground, we're hollering at them, telling them they're brushing too hard. Even though it's made up, we're still... What happened was, this is another angle. We were cleaning the vertebra, and had gotten it out of the jacket. And as I looked down at what's called the centrum, that's the main body of the vertebra, I noticed these gouges in it. Now, I'm very skeptical of what we call bite marks, because damage can occur in the burial process. But as I began to look more closely at these gouges, they were symmetrical. You'll notice here that this one right here has a matching one right here. So it was almost like it's set like this, same depth, same angle. I thought, now that's intriguing. And then I got over here and saw one here and here and here and here, and even a puncture here. And I said, this is not indicative of burial damage. This looks like somebody's chewed on this. As you come to find out, this is not common, but it's not unheard of to find bite marks. And so what we believe is, based on the size of the gouges and the other animals that we would have in our fossil record, it seems like Tyrannosaur bite marks would be the logical choice here. Now, I'm making a conjecture based on the information available. I don't know who bid on it, but based on the location of the bite marks, it suggests that this animal was probably already dead, and whoever ate on it was scavenging. Now, to kind of explain that for us in a biblical sense, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through the morning, the flood was not just an event that just washed in over the land and done, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. It was a progressively intensifying event, meaning that the flood waters would have come onto the land, burying life in a level, and wash back out to some degree, and then wash back in. And so what you're going to have is, during that time of the flood, a really disrupted ecosystem. You're going to have some animals that are dying or dead, and some animals that are still walking around looking for anything to eat. And I believe this is what we have here. Trackways is one of those things that you'll see. You know that walking in mud as a child or walking on the beach, that you can make tracks very easily as you walk, but how long do they last? On the beach until the next wave comes in, right? And so trackways to be preserved are that really specific dynamic that needs to occur where the ground needs to be wet and pliable, but yet solid enough that it's going to hold an impression, and then dry out enough to solidify and then get buried to be further preserved. And these are part of the kind of the pieces of evidence we look at as we see what the flood was doing, as it was creating this burial layer and bringing water in, and it created some environments that are really unique because we don't have fossilized trackways being preserved today. The flood gives us some very specific and unique conditions. Let me walk you through one more. This is a Triceratops skull, at least part of it that we got to work on. And we were called out to assist with some other people. There was a few bones sitting on the surface, but there was what was called a condyle that someone had picked up. Condyle is the ball at the base of the skull. And we came across this as we dug down. You'll see the nose horn on the left and the brow horn on the right. As it turned out, there was not much more than that right there. And here's as we're digging around. This was an interesting moment right here for me as I'm laying. I remember laying beside it, working on it one day. And I just stopped and I said, you know, God is cool. As a child, I wanted to be a paleontologist, and a Triceratops has always been my favorite dinosaur. And here I was, laying in a hole in the ground, working on a Triceratops. And I was struck by the providence and hand of the Lord as He brought me and enabled me in many respects to come and share a moment like that with you today. And I got to see not just be exposed to this animal, but to see the evidence of the burial. See, one thing that may not be readily apparent to you, here's the nose horn right here, and this is the brow horn. The thing that struck me here is his nose is here, but it was not attached to the rest of his head. That means his nose was snapped off and twisted around, which is a reminder of what? The processes of the burial were quite intense. This is what we see with dinosaurs in particular. As you think about the big ones, we marvel at the size of some of these animals, but when you dig them out of the ground, what you marvel at is how crushed and decimated their bodies were. The processes that were going on during the flood are beyond our comprehension. As we brought the nose horn in particular back, we began to work on it, and it's now on display. Now, part of what we enjoy doing is we enjoy the digging up, we enjoy the procedures of the lab, but I also enjoy getting to share and experience moments like this with you. The Lord has given me opportunity to talk through some things. If you'll allow me just a few minutes to talk through this idea of theology and science. Science is simply a pursuit of knowledge. And I'll flesh this out a little bit more because I want to begin to introduce and get you thinking a little bit here. But we all observe our world as we live in it. We take mental notes about how it works and how it functions. And we expect our world to function in a rational manner. While you may not be a professional scientist, you still practice as such, and I think that's part of how we were created. The Genesis 1 talks about that we're to subdue our world, to have dominion over it, to know our world. There's an inherent curiosity that we have been given as part of that divine stamp. I think about science and its necessity to change its mind because it is not a field of study that brings conclusion to really anything. You think about the ideas of science and how they've changed over the past several hundred years. And we need science to have that latitude. But when we think about theology, the study of God and who He is, His divine work, the authority of His Word, that Word doesn't change. And that's an important distinction. What we have in God's Word anchors the things that we do. Be a scientist, but anchor your science in an authority, in a Word that's unchanging. See, we talk about theology and science, and we live in a culture in which we hear the word, and I'm not going to digress too far into this, but how many times have you heard in the news over the past year and a half, we're following the science? A lot. Now, what you need to understand is that probably 9 times out of 10, they have just told you nothing. Because what happens is when we follow the science only, what we wind up doing is anchoring things in our own opinion, our own thoughts, and we're subject to false understanding. That's why we have to drive ourselves back to the authority of God's Word. See, creation does reveal things about God, but we need to remember in doing so that the earth is under a curse by God due to the sin of humanity. Genesis chapter 3. That is present, and that should be part of our understanding. Also, the earth has been judged by a global deluge, which means we need to account for that in our scientific processes. The flood itself was a geological event that altered everything. It changed everything, and it even had a spiritual implication behind it. Weather patterns, the lay of the ground, fossils, life, all of that was impacted by this one event. We need to be reminded that man's mind is finite and his capacities are impaired due to the fall. It doesn't mean we can't know. It doesn't mean we shouldn't study. It doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue and ask questions. We need to keep these things, though, in place. And due to his unrighteousness, man will interpret the natural world in a manner that will minimize or deny God. That is inherent within fallen humanity. And yet Paul in Romans chapter 1 talks about the fact that the things of God are plainly seen. And we'll talk again more about that in just a little bit. And so I like to anchor my thinking, my work in science with passages like Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. It is my exhortation to you is orient your thinking this way. Teach your children to think this way. Now, we are quarter till. Let's take about 5 or 6 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? Good question. Let me answer this a couple of ways. One is in paleontological ideas, if you find half of a skeleton, they're calling that a full skeleton. So as an example, if you find the entire left side, that's considered a complete skeleton because they would just simply mirror that to the right side, and they call that complete. It is fairly rare to find what we call an articulated skeleton, where we're going to find multiple bones of one animal. In the 37-acre ranch land that we own and spend most of our time on, we appear to be working on what's on the perimeter of a dispersion spot, where it's almost like all of these creatures, and I'm talking, when I mention T-Rex, Triceratops, and Montosaur, all the fish, all the turtles, all the gators, I'm talking literally in the area that you're sitting in, all of those pieces of all of those exist in this area, which tells me that something has been churned up and then deposited. Now, there are examples, and we get to work on a ranch in the area, where they'll find portions of skeletons. So where we're at most of the time, we don't ever anticipate finding 2 bones that would go to the same animal. But that does occur, and typically that can range anywhere from 10 to 30% on average if you find something like that. Yeah, that would be just because the flood's dispersion, the ground would be still wet, bones would be moved. You also got to remember that if you've got floodwaters over the ground and the sediment has begun to settle, when those floodwaters begin to run off, that's also going to pick up sediment and dirt and bones a second time, and you would have a further dispersion of an animal from there. So it makes it kind of, you got to work through what's going on here. Anybody else? Lene? As far as digs for dinosaurs, there's several spots across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, where that goes on. A lot of people have just ranchers. This is actually a fairly rancher-heavy environment where people have got 10, 20, 30, 50,000 acres of cattle ranch, and in the process, they will walk across a bone that they never knew they had. They weren't necessarily looking for that. And so there is a sense of randomness that can show up in that. As far as human bones, we do not find human bones. We do not anticipate human bones. Part of that is with the flood's potential progression, we begin to ask ourselves, how did humans respond to what they may have perceived coming? There's also just a geographic distribution. If the flood were to happen today, humans and elephants you wouldn't expect to find them buried together. Ultimately, it's not an impossibility. On the layer we're working in, I would say we do not expect to ever find that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next session, but I would just say soft tissue is the idea is that you've taken a bone and dissolved it in acid, and what's left is blood vessels, collagen, bone cells. Now, these are not fossilized forms of these things, but actual blood vessels that you would look under a microscope and be able to stretch. And the idea with this is these kind of things don't preserve for even a few weeks if left alone. They're out in hostile conditions. So what would keep that to be preserved for millions of years? How do you maintain that? What we think is this suggests a much more recent time frame with dinosaurs because of the soft tissue. That begins to alter the timeline. I will digress into this one point. There's an idea with iron, but there's no process that iron would preserve anything for millions of years. If iron is preserving anything, it might preserve it for a few thousand years, but not millions of years. So, good question, and we'll talk maybe more about it if we need to go further with it. Let's one or two more questions. Yeah. So how long does it take to work on? There can be a few factors in that. Sometimes size is a driving factor. The Triceratops vertebrae that I showed with the bite marks in it took all day, not so much because its size was overwhelming, but because there was a lot of twists and turns and details in it. There are also going to be other factors, the condition. Is it a nice solid bone, which would give me a little bit more comfort to be a little more aggressive, or is it a very fragile bone where it's coming apart and that would cause me to slow things down? I would say in general the tibia that's here, I'd say total probably 2 hours working on that. One more question. Yes, sir. No, we do find both of those, which is what's intriguing. We find 3 different species of fish, which we have modern equivalents. And when we're finding fish, we're not finding fish. Now, we've got over here some plates coming from Wyoming. We're not digging in that kind of sediment. What we're finding with fish are jaw pieces. We find garfish where their scales are have enamel on them, and so they preserve well. So we're finding individual pieces of fish. Plants are fairly plentiful. Martha got into something this year. We haven't really determined if it's a reed or not, what it might be, but it's about the size of my forearm, and thus far we have 5 feet of it out. And there's literally more in the ground right now. Now it's in a petrified state, but there is that much there. So we find a lot of coal that's mixed in with our bones, which is telling me that there's a presence of plants here. We'll find a fossilized tree trunk and then a 1/4-inch layer of coal over it, which is the bark. The tree trunk will be virtually gone. It's just with the impression, but you'll see that bark. So let's stop right here and take a short break, and we'll try to get going back here in just a few minutes, okay?